It's time to do that August reading wrap-up, starting with 1-star reviews. Taken by the Dragon King by Amelia Shaw. Full disclosure, I listened to this book on Apple Books and I was able to get it for free. I found so many elements of it gross as all get out. We started with the male love interest perspective and I just hated him from the first line on the page. And I was hoping we wouldn't get too much of him or that possibly he'd soften some, but he was always the same douchebag from when I started reading to about the 50 to 60% mark when I decided to stop reading. And honestly, I think Amelia Shaw has a similar style to E.L. James in that she prefers to identify with the male love interest versus the female protagonist, and she likes them to be gross, disgusting messes. So I guess there's a market out there for this character, but even if that's the case, we start with so much exposition. And even with all that knowledge, I was still really shocked to find out that the human world was in modern day and this dragon world is just in a medieval setting becausies. I did a rant review on Nora Roberts' The Awakening a couple years ago where I talked about how out of touch she was with the average 26-year-old because no one would want to go from modern times to medieval times. But I guess Amelia Shaw is under the same impression that a woman would want to go backwards in time, lose some of her rights, lose modern conveniences for a real strong man guy. I guess this is my opportunity to apologize to Nora Roberts because even though I don't get it and don't know anyone who feels this way, there must be a market for it because here it is again. Generally speaking, I didn't find him very dragony. I found the dragon world unpalatable in a whole host of ways. I didn't like that it was modern but not, that women there were used to not being as outspoken or to know their own mind or whatever. I hated how the dragon dude had been sleeping with this chica who wanted to stay with him, and that chica becomes the enemies of the fated mate girly boo who pops in. I just hate when women be fighting women for no good reason. All of it just sucked and I was not here for it. Which brings me into The Pack's Mate by Amelia Shaw. I also got this audiobook for free on Apple Books and I didn't know at the time of picking it up and listening to it was by the same author. I just DNF'd. But in the first chapter, it became really clear to me that tonally this sounded a lot like what I had just put away. And that was more than enough for me to decide that this book and this author was not for me and stop reading at this juncture. Next is going to be The Night Calling by Liana Haygert. This is another book where I got the audiobook via Apple Books for free. And first thing I noticed is even in audio format, the writing is quite poor. There is bad grammar. There's super repetitive elements. It makes the classic rookie mistake of describing every last thing a character is doing. I absolutely hate that, and it's such a waste of time when you could be doing something emotionally driven or plot-wise driven instead of just hammering in all the little minutiae to get to the main point. And to be honest, I did not like the choices the narrator made when reading the book. She has this really angsty, quavery, over-the-top, emotional, fear kind of scenario and woe is me sort of feeling to the main love interest. And I don't know if this was the direction she was given, if this is just how she thought the prose was, but there is definitely a world where I can imagine some of these lines being given more matter-of-factly and me empathizing more with them and feeling an actual impact instead of this over-the-top melodrama that made me feel like it just wanted to be an angsty, edgy thing without any substance. I did listen to this whole book, so I can tell you that the plot borders on generic to bad, just depending on where you land. I sort of suspect that this is a follow-up to another original series because there's a lot of little details and elements that are missing or entirely glossed over. I think if you're going to make a follow-up series, especially if you're not going to make any note of it, then it needs to stand on its own and not be
wow, I'm missing a lot of context. Wow, the interesting part happened in the last series and this one is just here cleaning up the mess.
But what brought this down from a 2-star read into a 1-star for me is the unforgivable amount of gaslighting going on with this poor main love interest. She's this girl who apparently was the omega of the pack before it was taken over by demons, and for some reason the demon is favoring her. And then we come to find out that this werewolf who ran away from the hostile takeover is actually her mate, and he's also in line to be the real true alpha of this pack because he was the son of the alpha and she was the daughter of the omega. Omega, he was very aggressively mean to her, picked on her, bullied her, along with many of his peers, when he could have set a precedent to be kind to her, or he could have protected and sheltered her, or he could have influenced other people to act in a different way. He did not. Instead, he reinforced bad behavior. And he wants a pass for that because his dad was a little rough on him. And people who have read this book might be like,
yes, he was more than a little rough on him.
But here's the thing, I can't really identify that either because the messaging is very garbled on who this guy's dad was. Was he a good alpha? Was he a good leader of the pack? Or was he cruel and overbearing? Because they talk about how he was like kind of a junky father, but a good alpha, and how like the ends justify the means when it comes to being like the leader and learning your lessons and being prepared. But at the same time, it will talk about how he had a vendetta specifically against this girl's mom, how he singled them out and was mean to them and like isolated them, and how he would never have allowed them to leave Packlands and all this other kind of stuff. And I was like,
doesn't sound like a good leader.
they say that he was like a great guy to his mate, but at the same time, he is abusing some of his mate's children. His mate is trying to step in to stop that. He's ignoring what she wants, what she feels, what she thinks. He's overbearing. He's like pushing her to the side and taking over the situation. So I just don't think this guy's dad was a good dude. Period. But the fact that he keeps coming back to like this dad having a redemptive arc, this mom being a good mom, but also not really standing up and doing what's right, and somehow being in love with this abusive jerk. He could pick up things and learn things from this abusive jerk, that he's going to carry over certain treatment and elements that I would consider abusive into this next relationship, that he keeps insisting this relationship has been fine and that he's been in love with her all along. And quite frankly, it felt really bad, and it made me decide that I did not like this book and could not recommend it. Which rolls me into 2-star reads. Starting with Wake's Claim by Michelle Dare. This is another audiobook I got for free on Apple Books. I didn't hate this, but there were some elements that either did not work, felt clunky and awkward, or just were out of nowhere. It's another book where I feel like there's probably an original series and this is a follow-up series, and all the interesting stuff happened in the original series. Also, there's this one character who like has been through a lot of trauma or whatever, and she's the main character's best friend. I feel like the previous series was all about her, and we spend a lot of time like idolizing this girl, spending main character energy on this other girl and her situation and pitying and focusing in on her, where I'm supposed to be here for the friend and her love story, what she's been through and what she's struggling with. So it just felt like an opportunity for the best friend to continue to be a supportive best friend while she also gets a relationship, which is always a little bit kind of sort of weird. I didn't finish this. I got to like the 60 or the 70% mark. I saw where it was going and I felt that it had happened abruptly. The romance element was unearned and that I wasn't really here for a relationship between these two. Additionally, it's another werewolf shifter romance book where I don't feel like either the werewolf element or any of the vampire elements were implemented well. There's not a very good understanding on who is pack or what the pack means. There's some kind of witch element involved where they can trick you into thinking that somebody else is your true mate when they're really not, which sort of like undermines the concept of true mates in a way I haven't seen done before, and it makes it like less romantic and fun and something I'm willing to go with. Overall, this was just not for me, although it has a pretty decent cover. Next is going to be Iron Flame by Rebecca Yarros. This is really more like a 2.5 stars. I'm rounding down to 2. I more or less enjoyed reading and am more or less interested in reading the last in the series based off where the second one left me. That said, I do have a lot of issues with this book, generally on characterization, although I'll say a lot of issues that other booktubers have mentioned I found less egregious than they did. For example, I'm pretty much fine with everything that happens in the book all the way through the part where we rescue Violet from being tortured and go into the rebel camp. And I'm not down with every choice Violet makes, but I do see a world where she has some kind of post-traumatic stress from the attack that she faced at the end of book 1, and these are the lessons she's learned or the way that she's working through these issues. And I guess part of my issue does start in the front part of this book because I just think that Violet and her love interest should not be together. I 100% get why Violet needs a relationship that doesn't have secrets, which makes someone like this dude the wrong choice for her. He has has a position where he needs to keep secrets from other people and has a need to know basis kind of thing. What I'm not fine with is how their physical attraction seems to overwhelm their different needs, wants, and opinions on relationships to sort of like smash cut them together, and for this to be a large thing we have to deal with in the back half of this book. And I will say that this is supposed to be new adult fiction, and I found it very young adult. It lacks a lot of depth and nuance. It frames some things in a positive light, even after we've come out of conditioning, we've got a different point of view, that I just don't think should be framed positively, and there's not like enough pushback or dissenting opinions or like even attempting to see things in a different way. And I would also say overall plot-wise and journey-wise, this is written really sloppily. I felt like I was reading a vomit draft that had been checked for grammar and nothing else. It really needed like 2 or 3 more developmental edits. It needed to be cut about 300 to 400 pages and tightened up. And instead of doing that, we rushed it out to publication. And I think this is really where you can see the flaw in the publishing company's plan to rapid release. A lot of things I could see building and setting stage for in the first book. I can see where and how they wanted to execute it here in the second book, but it's not connecting very well because there just wasn't enough editing passes or enough time to cook. Moving me into 3 stars. Compound 26 by Krista Street. This is another audiobook I got for free from Apple Books. It's supposed to be a young adult virus post-apocalyptic dystopian romance novel, and I have a lot to say about it, about 23 pages of script to be exact, and I will talk about it in further detail there. That said, this is a 3 star as a book as a whole and a 2 to 1 star if you're actually thinking about it in the context of a young adult novel. This is a pandemic plague series that was written in 2018 before COVID, so we have a lot more information and experience than she would have had when she was originally writing the novel, and I am trying not to hold that against her. But the romance itself is grossly inappropriate, specifically to be featuring in a romantic light teens who might think that like a power imbalance like this could be hot and not understand some of the dynamics and elements that make it abusive and harmful. I also found this main character, while she was like quiet and reserved and awkward, was also like very horny and porn-brained. Seemed to be obsessed with people's physical appearance, no matter how old or young they were, no matter if they were like her boss or like her underling. I think it's really harmful to normalize that kind of mindset for teens specifically, because they're sort of struggling with their looks and their appearance and their presentation, and they're sort of like always worried that like everyone is focusing in on them and thinking this one thing because of this very minute detail. So having a character like literally doing that to everyone she meets is probably not great. There's some weirdly gendered stuff and like weird messaging around gender roles in the book. I think they were trying to like highlight the gender gap in STEM fields, but instead of doing that in like a meaningful way, it's more like reinforcing that women have this nurturing, loving role inherently and men are like more cold and removed. Even how they gendered different villains, how different people accomplish different tasks. Street generally writes adult paranormal romances, and I think she should stick to that and steer clear of young adult genres in the future. Next is going to be A Throne for Sisters by Morgan Rice, which is another audiobook I got for free on Apple Books. So the positives here is I didn't mind the sister dual perspective. The fantasy world itself is generic but not clunky. Some of the blacksmithing stuff we got was fun. And I felt like the blacksmithing piece in relation to Kate herself was a good metaphor, comparison / teaching tool. It's the first book in a series, so I am assuming a lot of the stuff that doesn't currently connect or that feels a little disjointed ties in later or sets up things down the line. Putting on my writer's hat for a minute, having the sisters being able to communicate to each other in their heads and having their differing perspectives and the 2 of them going on very different journeys throughout the kingdom, it would have been a lot more fun, I think, to have book 1 set them up here in the orphanage, what they've experienced, going through all of that, all the way up through their point of escape and the 2 of them taking separate paths, and that being a jumping off point for 2 separate parallel running series, where one series we talk about this girl's political intrigue in the high-end courts, and in the other series we talk about this girl girl adventuring and exploring and doing all that kind of stuff. Because I know young adult Jess, really into the fantasy era, probably would have like read both series. But even if I had chosen one, I can imagine my friends choosing the other and the two of us like catching up on each other's journeys through these parallel worlds. And like every couple of books, you could have a joint one where the two of them come together and work on a problem or whatever. And that would be like where their journeys overlap and where them being sisters and having these different experiences and places would have relevance again. And I feel like that would have been less jarring, would have created more books, would have been a really cool marketing thing, and would have made this world like offer something unique and new even in a fairly generic fantasy setting. But I did have some issues with how love, sex, relationships were handled in this book, specifically because it is meant for young adults. Even as an adult, I found some of these things to be like really abrupt, lacking chemistry, lacking emotional pull behind them. From this book one experience, I have some interest in continuing the series, but probably not enough for me to ever buy book two. Next is going to be Metzengerstien by Edgar Allan Poe, and apologies for butchering that name. This is the very first work Edgar Allan Poe ever wrote. I'm attempting a Poe project where I will get into more detail about this short story. Overall, I thought it was fine. There are reasons I can imagine you'd read this. If you want to do a comparative analysis between this and The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole, if you wanted to read this and do a comparative analysis with later works in Poe's library and how he executes on a lot of these ideas and concepts significantly better further in the road. If you just happen to want to see the origin of a lot of concepts and ideas that Poe continues to work later on. Maybe if you were doing a Poe class and you just wanted to cover all of his Gothic works. If you're just pleasure reading, or if you just want to cover like major influential classics, this one is probably not going to make your list. It was written a lot better than many of the things I happen to read this month, or even read most months on Kindle Unlimited. But as far as like compared to others of Poe's works, as far as compared to other Gothic fiction, compared to classics as a whole, I just am not confident this one's worth your time. Next is going to be Wolf's Bane by Amie Easterling. This is another audiobook I got for free on Apple Books, and of all of those books, this is probably the only one I considered going into book two. The writing itself isn't great. I don't have a good idea about the special magic thing that the fox shifters have. I don't have a great idea about the world itself. It took me a long time into the story to realize that it was just like our present day, except there are secret wolf and fox shifters and witches and maybe other stuff I don't know about. And it does seem like a lot of stuff is kept secret specifically so that the story can go in whatever direction it needs to, and the protagonist can act however they need to make the scene go forward. I like the idea of like a sword-trained fox shifter hiding her allegiance from wolf shifters. I even like the idea that she's got like a young sister tag along she's trying to protect and keep safe as well. The way all this is executed doesn't come together 100%. Some of the differences between wolf shifters versus fox shifters felt like animal racist, or like excusing bad behaviors as part of their fox nature or wolf nature, like they just can't help it. That is a staple in the shifter genre, that you are like both human and animal at the same time, and you have these dueling instincts within you. But the way it was used here specifically, like fox shifters have a temper and it's very easily ignited, and once ignited they just say and do horrible things. Fox shifters being very curious. I liked that curiosity, but at the same time, sometimes instead of reining that curiosity in or having like their general safety need override their curiosity, they just use this as an excuse for characters to walk into stupid situations. Not to mention that the wolves are apparently doing some kind of genocide against fox shifters for something inherent in who they are that they can't help. The protagonist's younger sister walks the line between being unspeakably annoying and frustrating and like an accurate portrayal of a young teen girl. I do think there are several occasions where she goes too far, or she's just too stupid to live. When she sells all of her dead mother's things like jewelry and stuff, I think that was her going too far, especially not talking to her sister, where even if she doesn't have an emotional connection to those things, she must know her sister does, or why else would they still have them? When she goes a step further and sells her mother's like ball of magic or whatever, I think that goes into too stupid to live. People in this world don't know about magic and stuff, and also this like magic ball or whatever is the reason that the wolf shifters are hunting foxes down and killing them. At this juncture, foxes are like an endangered species and they're a minority sort of like running and hiding. But how did that even come about that they're in this situation? If foxes have this magic and this major advantage over wolf shifters, I don't know how the wolves ever were able to exterminate enough to have this upper hand in hierarchy now. But all of that is sort of like world building issues and some character driven elements of it. As a story, if you're not thinking too hard and you're just sitting there listening and going along for the ride, it's fine. And as someone who reads a lot of shifter romance, I like when we mix it up and change it from wolves into foxes and have very distinctive differences between the two species. Moving me into Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. This is a 3.5 star that I've rounded down into 3. Again, the first thing that hit me was how young adult this felt versus the new adult that it was sold as. And while I'm able to suspend my disbelief about how the war college as a whole functions, like murdering off cadets and all that sort of thing, I did have a hard time suspending my disbelief about how dragons and humans interacted. Like both internally, externally, it just doesn't make sense to me. If you have this strong bond with this human and there's a risk that you might die if they die, and then you're not afraid to just throw them off your back when you're flying together and you're not going to catch them or anything, that doesn't make sense to me. And if the dragons just see humans as a tool, that's fine. But then the relationship that happens in these dragon rider bonds should look differently, even in like the more affectionate or compassionate ones. Like even if you wanted to say dragon and human relationships are more like people-dog relationships, generally speaking, people wouldn't go out and murder puppies. And they would think that killing puppies was a bad thing. But these dragons have no issue like murdering cadets or watching them die trying to get to them. Just because you don't want to bond with a certain human doesn't mean you should want them dead. And if you do choose to bond with them and then let them die because they didn't know X, Y, and Z thing you intentionally kept hidden, that also just feels real weird to me. And something that I didn't tackle when I talked about Iron Flame, but I'll hit here, I was really excited, interested, curious about Endarna. I accepted in the first book we weren't getting a lot of Endarna time because there were just so many new things to explore and experience and set up and negotiate, and I was expecting things to pick up in the second book about Endarna. And sort of kind of they do at the very end of the book, but that comes out of nowhere with no good build or rising or like satisfying incremental drop of information. So to that end, like I don't really understand why we had to have Violet bond two dragons, how that differentiates her from other people. Like I start to have problems with all that too. I haven't decided if there's going to be a longer video or not about these two books. I sort of am leaning towards yes, because there's a lot of things I want to break down and explain, but didn't feel like a monthly wrap up was the right venue for it. But talk to me in those comments down below. Tell me if you would like a longer review of Fourth Wing and Iron Flame, or if you're kind of like Rebecca Yarros out at this point. Which moves me into 4-star reviews. Starting with The Haar by David Sodergren. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that last name. This was the book of the month for my Weirdo Book Club over on the Fable Book app. And you guys might know the Weirdo Book Club here on YouTube. She is the host, and I highly recommend her content as well as the book club. It was a lot of fun. I really had a good time reading this. I had a good time commenting chapter by chapter in the group. I thought the story about like this creature coming in onto the Scottish coast, befriending this 70-year-old woman, and the two of them sort of like standing up against this encroaching billionaire was fine. There were a couple of elements about it that didn't 100% gel or connect. There were a few things that were just like a little bit disappointing or didn't push hard enough, which is why it's at a 4-star instead of a 5. But I had a really fun time. I think there's a lot of great writing, good description. I think the monster itself is unique and interesting. We get enough about what's driving it without too much. And I felt like the end was satisfying, although not necessarily horrific. And I think it does a good job bordering between just like general horror, body horror, monster horror, and like extreme horror. Because some of the descriptions do get to be gruesome, a little bit much. There were a couple of places it went where I would have appreciated if it had not. But overall, I think all of that is done fairly tastefully, has a purpose, and is satisfying in execution. Next is gonna be Berenice by Edgar Allan Poe. This was fine. I'm a lot more interested in the history story and the buzz surrounding this short story when it first came out than I am the short story itself. It was probably considered extreme horror in its time frame, but as someone who's read modern extreme horror, I can tell you it doesn't really hold a candle to it. It does have like your traditional Poe creepiness. It introduces like some insanity, buried alive shenanigans. It's very short. It's got that going for it. I do plan this one to have its own separate video as well, but it was a fun read. I think I would recommend this to someone if they wanted to see like an early version of what was originally written as clickbait. I think there's also like enough entertainment factor here for you just to read it for fun. Which brings me into 5-star reads. Jackrabbit Skin by Ivy Pochada. This is part of the Amazon Never Tell collection, and I do have a standalone video coming out about all of the books there. This one is so much fun. I love the tattooing, artistic element that you can see woven in the prose here. I like that passion for creativity, the losing yourself in the work. All of that is really fun for me to read. I liked this like reoccurring push back into social media that was like slightly ironic because this woman has to be involved in social media and self-promotion for her art, but at the same time she understands how this is like an aesthetic, false, touristy kind of thing that's very superficial and not really about like what does or doesn't sell or what a place is actually like. That contrast was nice. Really, I just liked everything about this story, how it was told, all that good stuff, and I've downloaded another book by this author on my Kindle Unlimited to read next month. Next is The Bad Friend by Carolyn Kepnes. I love second-person narration, so starting off that way was strong for me. I think what it does and how it does it is really fun in like a short little novella kind of form. I think that people who came into the Never Tell collection specifically looking for thriller are gonna find this like a disappointing, maybe even an infuriating ending to the collection. As someone who like sort of is newer to thrillers and walks the line between thriller and speculative fiction, I liked how this executed, subverted the thriller genre and left a lot of things for me to think about and consider at the end. The Bad Friend is something that has like a twist reveal in it, where there's a lot of slow burn in the front. You're wondering where it's going, what it's doing, when we're gonna get to the thriller element. So I do think it's best not to talk about it in too much detail, but pretty much everyone in The Bad Friend is a little bit despicable in some way, shape, and form, and it's about unraveling exactly the how and the why of that starts to make this an interesting read. And that's gonna be everything I read this month in August. I think it was like a surprisingly dragon-centric month for me, and I was able to get a lot of reading done this month versus other months just on page count alone. But what about you? Was August a good or a bad reading month? And as always, keep reading.